look forward to your report.
Chair, sorry, I had my hand up. I thought you were just doing your sound check. Yeah, so sorry to interrupt you. Just before we start and get to Mr. McGinty, and I agree in the crucial information we need to hear from him. I wish we would have him here for 8 hours, actually, although that's not very considerate of his own life. But
don't tempt him.
I've just had
Yes, I know we are, Chair. I'm just, it's about that. I'm wondering whether there'd be a will to extend the Chair's time today to be able to hear it for at least, 20 minutes, half an hour, if possible, for the Q&A.
The Chair?
No, for the Chair of the NSECOP.
I
Not you,
I didn't
David.
think you wanted to hear from me. That would have been a bit of a surprise.
John.
Well, I'm rather hoping to get through 3 rounds of questions, which would probably take us through more than the allocated hour. And if Mr. McGinty is available, then I'm sure that members will be accommodating, and Mr. McGinty may also be accommodating, I'm hope. So let's get launched for the first hour and see where that leaves us. But I think there is probably an appetite to go beyond the allotted hour, based upon his last appearance here, where he had a lot of interest on the part of members. So, David, please, for your first presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and honourable members of the committee. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear again today at this committee. Je suis ravi d'avoir l'occasion de vous parler du rapport annuel 2020.
It's a great pleasure to speak with you about the 2020 annual report of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, known as NSICOP. Je suis ici aujourd'hui avec Sean Jorgensen.
Colleagues, since 2017, NSECOP has conducted 7 reviews, which were included in 3 annual reports and 2 special reports. We are currently conducting 2 new reviews, one on the security and intelligence activities of Global Affairs Canada, and another on cyber defense. And we've initiated yet a 3rd on the RCMP's federal policing mandate. This 2020 annual report is the only consolidated overview of national security threats to Canada. J'aimerais souligner que les rapports du CPSNR.
I would like to emphasize that our reports are unanimous and nonpartisan. We prepare and finalize reports through consensus, and all members agree on final content, assessments, and recommendations.
Turn to the Jim Judd report, completed pursuant to the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol. As the committee documented in its 2019 review of foreign interference, a number of states try to interfere in Canada's electoral processes. They use a number of methods, including covertly trying to influence, for example, riding nominations, or trying to promote one candidate or undermine another. It may involve illegal campaign contributions and efforts that seek leverage over officials to apply pressure. This happens to all parties, across all orders of government. Officials may be wittingly or unwittingly subject to foreign interference activities. In the cyber realm, it could involve foreign efforts to amplify social divisions, stoke hatred online, or to sharpen partisan differences. That latter point is important. Foreign states try to use partisan groups, even political parties, to pursue their own agendas. Par conséquent, le comité a appuyé les recommandations de M. Judd.
As a result, the committee supported Mr. Judd's recommendations to reestablish the public protocol well in advance of the next federal election. and to extend the protocol's mandate to the pre-writ period. The committee also believed that the government should consider 4 other issues.
Ensure that the mandate of the protocol includes all forms of foreign interference. 2, consider including prominent Canadians as members of the panel. If a foreign state is trying to manipulate partisan groups, it may be more effective for a prominent, respected Canadian to alert the public about what's happening. 3, absolutely ensure that all political parties understand the purpose of the protocol and the process for raising a potential issue. And 4, consider how the panel would actually inform Canadians about an incident of foreign interference. This is important. Foreign states try to stoke partisan differences. We will want to be careful about publicizing such efforts and attributing behavior to particular countries. I will now turn, Mr. Chair, to the annual report's overview of 5 national security threats to Canada: terrorism, espionage and foreign interference, cyber threats, organized crime, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I will focus on the first 3 as they have changed the most since 2018, when NSECU first addressed these threats. Terrorism. La défaite de Daesh en Syrie et en Irak en 2000.
The defeat of Daesh in Syria and Iraq in 2019 was a significant milestone in global efforts to counter Salafi jihadist terrorism. But it created other problems, including what to do with Canadians who had traveled to the area to support terrorist groups. As this committee knows well, those individuals may continue to pose a threat to Canada and its allies.
They're ideologically motivated violent extremists. These include individuals and groups which embrace xenophobic violence, anti-authority violence, and gender-driven violence. While the restrictions imposed as part of the COVID lockdown, such as limitations on travel, have disrupted terrorism facilitation efforts, the pandemic and the concurrent anti-racism protests have increased anti-government rhetoric connected to ideologically motivated violent extremism. Espionage and foreign interference. I should be clear that espionage and foreign interference are quite distinct. Espionage involves the theft of information. Foreign interference involves the use of clandestine means or threats to promote a certain position or objective. However, the security and intelligence community usually treat them as a single threat because the perpetrators, foreign states, often pursue them in tandem. In 2019, the committee found that foreign interference posed a significant threat to the security of Canada. That continues today. Le changement le plus important est
The most significant change has been to the threat posed by espionage. Foreign states are increasingly targeting Canada's science and technology sectors. The pandemic created opportunities for foreign states, most notably Russia and China, to target Canada's health sector, most notably in the area of vaccine development.
There are a wide array of cyber threats facing Canada. In terms of sophisticated state-sponsored threats, Russia and China remain the most significant. These countries continue to target government and non-government systems, including those that provide critical infrastructure within Canada, and more recently, those involved in vaccine development. Nous avons également vu des acteurs étatiques mener des campagnes de désinformation.
We have also seen state actors conduct online disinformation campaigns in Canada and among our allies. Those same actors also use sophisticated methods to target, harass, or threaten dissidents within Canada.
Threats to the security of Canada are fluid, and they are changing. These are all things which we parliamentarians from across the political spectrum should continue to pay attention to and seek ways to address through our hearings, our work on legislation, and through our engagement with Canadians. I'd be happy to take your questions, Mr. Chair, through you to the committee members, reminding committee members that members of NSECOP have waived their parliamentary privilege. So I will have to be, of course, circumspect in answering questions with any detail that might take me into classified information territory. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGuinty, and this will start our first round of questions of 6 minutes. Mr. Couric is having difficulties with the gap between the translations. Not quite sure what the issue is. It does seem to be a bit of a lag between when you switch languages from English to French or French to English. Mr. Motz, I see your hands up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's something that we mentioned previously when the speaker is done speaking French, and then whoever makes the switch between the volume from the French translation to the actual English pickup of the speaker, there's a lag of sometimes 8 to 10, 12 seconds, and you miss. You have to crank up your volume, or sometimes you can't even hear what they're saying. It's not the first time that we've had this experience. Yeah. It happens in the House as well.
The clerk is looking into it, see if we can shrink that time lag. So it's the best I can do under the circumstances, but we are on it as best we can. So with that, Ms. Stubbs, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Mr. McGuinty, for being here for your testimony and your very important work with the other members of your committee. I know that China has recently released its 6G strategy, which called for every action user to be registered, traceable, and exposed to censorship. And it seems to be the case that China seems completely undeterred by Western bans and maybe Western countries' domestic decisions. And I note too that your report says that one cyber tool could be used to track individuals in 45 countries. I just wonder if you would expand on that issue to the degree that you can. And if you have any thoughts about what is needed at this time to prevent countries like Russia and China from employing that type of censorship and manipulations, and whether or not a ban goes far enough, or if there's other actions Western countries can take.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Let me just perhaps begin. I think I detected an oblique reference to Huawei, perhaps in this question, but I want to be clear. The committee has not conducted a review of this issue. We have been briefed by CSE officials on the measures CSE has put in place to test Huawei products that are present in Canada's existing telecoms market, but I can't comment further than that in terms of that particular issue. I also want to just point out for committee members that the report is replete with references to China. That is a deliberate choice by committee members. In fact, in many different contexts, in 15 separate paragraphs, there are direct references to China and the activities they may be pursuing in a Canadian context. So with respect to, I can't go much further in terms of giving you more detail in terms of how the government might, or our security and intelligence community might respond more appropriately I think it's important to remind members, though, that we did make a major recommendation to the Government of Canada in our 2019 report, asking the government to bear down on questions around the activities of China and to come to the fore with a whole of government approach. It seems that Minister of Public Safety, Minister Blair, has begun that process, but we're waiting to see more information from the government eventually to see, Ms. Stubbs, what that whole of government approach looks like.
Okay. Well, and certainly your report, as your testimony has done, outlines the clear threats of foreign intervention and interference to Canadian national security and economic security. Threats, I think, to us as a country as a whole and to individual Canadian citizens. And yeah, repeatedly mentions Russia and China as consistently bad actors. It seems in the case of China, it's been for a long time. But do you have any comment, or can you comment on whether or not there has been a difference or an uptick or a change in China's approach to Canada since the arrest and extradition, and then also the imprisonment of the two Michaels? Can you make any comments on that?
I don't think our report examined a before and after scenario from 2018 to 2020 in terms of the quantum of activity by China. I might ask, if I could, my research colleague Sean Jorgensen, for you, Ms. Stubbs, to respond, if that would be helpful. I think he might have a bit more detail for you.
Sure.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, actually, Madam Stubbs, I would point to the 2019 report where we did identify a particular period, 2012, when Xi Jinping became essentially the president of China and took a very different approach to foreign interference globally. And we documented, for example, some very specific threats to Canada, where Chinese officials were coming to Canada to apply pressure on either Canadian citizens of Chinese origin or people who had come to Canada in their immigration process. So that was a very distinctive change in 2012, which, as I understand it, continues on to today, not just in Canada, but in some of our closest allies as well.
Thank you. And thanks, Chair. Well, hopefully we can get to this. On page 18, your report does note, quote, foreign states are increasingly targeting Canada's science and technology sector, and it does point to China's Thousand Talents program as a perpetrator, and that through that program, quote, intellectual property is often transferred to China. So your report does note an increase in that. Can you expand about any details on that point?
Would welcome the opportunity to do so, but beyond what's in the text, Ms. Stubbs, on pages 18, under the rubric of espionage, it's very difficult for me to go into more detail. I think it's fair to say that increasingly our science and technology community in Canada, our academic community in Canada, is becoming more aware of the inherent risks. We understand that CSIS is now reaching out on a regular basis to brief academic experts and academic administrators on the reality of this situation, and we hope that this will raise the profile of the need to address this and to be aware. So that's a very important question. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Ms. Stubbs. I'm advised by the clerk that this is a system-wide problem. So if those speakers who are switching from English to French or French to English could just give a little bit of a pause to let the system in effect catch up before they, as they switch languages, then I think that would be helpful to everyone. Mr. Lightbound, 6 minutes, please.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our two witnesses. One of the things that I noticed in your report is the change in terrorist threats in Canada. In particular, you talked about violent extremism based on ideology. The 2009 index showed that there was a 320% increase in incidents related to ideological extremism. There were a number of tragedies in Christchurch and in Germany, and that are related to violent extremism based on ideology. You also mention in your report that this type of extremism is different from Daesh in that it's less affiliated, less centralized. These are diffuse actors, and they're different compared to some of the more conventional threats that we've seen in the past decades. So what kind of challenge does that pose for our intelligence agencies, and how are agencies adjusting to the change in the threat?
Thank you indeed, Mr. Lightbound. And we attempted in the report to reflect what we heard from the security and intelligence community. And what surprised us most in 2020 is the increase of activities in this area. Les EVCI en français. And the momentum seems to go faster and faster and spread to more and more groups with a higher number of participants. And we all know that the extremist messaging isn't always criminal in its nature. But we know that Canada has an ever wider basis and also provides a base where people can seek to recruit more and more people who, I don't know how to say this, but people who might be more vulnerable or open to being radicalized. And our security and intelligence services are concerned about what is happening in this area, particularly the increase in such activities. And this we were able to experience and witness abroad in New Zealand, for instance. And several episodes took place. And that we have happened in Texas, twice in Germany. And also we needed to look after other kinds of groups.
Growing threat. We know that it's increasingly overlapping with other IMVE type violent extremism. And of course, we saw a van attack in April 2018. We saw a stabbing in June 2019 in Sudbury. We saw an individual motivated by the incel ideology in February 2020, another stabbing in Toronto. So this is perhaps the most striking thing about this review for us in terms of, Mr. Chair, monitoring the trend. And Mr. Lightbound rightly points out that it's a surprise. It's a surprise, I think, to our security and intelligence community, but they are very much seized with this based on what we've seen and the information we've obtained.
Et est-ce que vous avez constaté à travers dans
In your report, did you notice a stepping up of these events, and which would be linked to the pandemic? Did this contribute to radicalizing more the people concerned? Well, in each of the 5 topics or themes that we dealt with, at the end of the chapter, we did our best to provide a specific analysis of what happened since the onset of the pandemic of COVID-19 regarding those 5 fields.
We know that there has been a decrease in mass gatherings. We know that there have been a closure of public spaces, and that may have, for example, limits on travel. These things may have had a bearing on driving activity further online. So this is something that the RCMP is examining, and they believe it could result in people looking for advice or information over the internet and accessing what we call extremist echo chambers. So COVID-19, more social isolation, more financial hardship during the restrictions, we believe has likely put more of this type of IMVE and incel activity online.
Thank you, Mr. Lightbound. Madame Michaud, 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci, Monsieur McGinty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McGinty, for your work. So I want to make sure that the committee's mandate is to take stock of the threats and to provide recommendations to the Prime Minister. And after that, it is up to the government to make a decision on what to do or not what to do. Is that true? Yes, Madame Michaud, you're absolutely right to say that, yeah, we have a very, very determined and rigorous approach in order to carry out our reviews, and the reports are provided to the Prime Minister, and they might then be made public through the House of Commons. Thank you. So you refer to terrorism as being the major threat, but you also the most prominent threat. But you also mentioned cyber threats and other international issues. Now, do you perceive those new threats as a form of terrorism? For instance, the foreign interference on social networks, including intellectual property. Are these new forms of threats? Madame Michaud, in the security and intelligence community, there is a perception of risks which is divided in 5 topics, terrorism, cyber activity, and so on and so forth, the 5 topics which we mentioned in our report. But I'm not sure that we can say today that there will be a moment when terrorism was moved to the online domain, as you seem to mention. But terrorism, this being said, terrorism is now, yes, promoting more activity on the internet on the part of terrorist-leaning people. Question. Regarding traveling during the pandemic, you said that this might have reduced the travels for the purpose of having terrorist activities. Answer. Yes, in our report, we have reflected what we heard from the RCMP and other agencies, namely that the very sophisticated approach that prevailed before the pandemic seems to have been dulled to some extent. It had been reduced, and so public places and people where people tend to meet or hold mass gatherings are less numerous. But I believe that my colleague, Mr. Jorgensen, might have something to add in this area. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The only thing I'd add for Ms. Michaud is the reduction in travel also means, of course, reduction in air flights, which is one, as you know, one of the key threat vectors for terrorism. You've also seen, though, very significant reductions on immigration, and was another vector, for example, into certain countries, people illicitly coming into countries under the guise of immigration. So there's been a number of restrictions imposed on travel and movement of people that have in turn then restricted certain activities of terrorist groups as well.
Merci, c'est apprécié. Et j'aimerais revenir.
Thank you. Let me go back to the rise of far-right movements such as the Proud Boys. In Canada, it seems that this has been at the moment dismantled in Canada, but there is a kind of resurgence in the United States, for instance. And people say that there are networks such as QAnon. Let me find in my papers. Yes, that Canada is one of 4 main countries generating QAnon activities after the United States, the UK, and Australia. So there seem to be more and more people who are joining these conspiracy theories, and Canada is still vulnerable to this. So are we prepared to confront such a threat, although this is a new threat which we haven't had the chance to study so far? Yes, there is a lot of work to do, Madame Michaud. And if I may continue in English for a moment.
2015, at least 100 white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups existed in Canada. The vast majority of these are ideologically motivated violent extremism groups. However, our research, and this was also new to us, more recent estimates suggest that there are closer to 300 such groups across Canada. So there have been a major increase. Neo-Nazi groups active and growing. And clearly, as you rightly point out, Madame Michaud, the threat of IMVE, ideologically motivated violent extremism, is growing around the world. It's increased by 320% from 2013 to 2018. So it's a very serious matter for Canada. It's a very serious matter for our security and intelligence organizations, and it's a very serious matter for parliamentarians.
Thank you, Madame Michaud.
Yes.
Mr. Harris, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our colleague, Mr. McGuinty, for joining us today. Very interesting report. And you, first of all, I'd just like to ask you, you've called your report as an update of a threat assessment first undertaken by your committee in the 2018 report. Now, first of all, I'm one of those people who's not very happy to have a committee such as yours made up of not of Parliament, but of parliamentarians who report to the Prime Minister, who redacts the report, and we get to talk to you instead of you reporting to Parliament. But that being said, if you're doing threat assessments, shouldn't the Parliament require that these agents table an integrated and an unclassified, unredacted threat assessment to the members of Parliament, or to Parliament, the same way that is done in the United States by the Director of National Intelligence there? Is that not a proper method of ensuring that Parliament is aware of the threats to this country?
I thank you, Mr. Harris, for the question. And I think committee members would consider that the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians is a proxy group for the whole of Parliament, both the House of Commons and the Senate. They have been cleared to a sufficiently high level to be able to hear the classified information for the first time in Canadian history, and work on behalf of all parliamentarians to hear the information, deliberate in a completely nonpartisan setting, and then, yes, deliver up a report that's classified to the Prime Minister, and from there it goes through the normal Canada Evidence Act process of redaction, and then is ultimately tabled. So we felt as a committee it would be helpful for Canadians, parliamentarians, and Canadians writ large to provide a single source of authoritative information on the threats to our national security. Hence the update from the 2018 first foray into producing that assessment.
But we know that the redactions are those that are related to national security. Well, surely, if the redactions involve that, then we're actually not getting the actual threat assessment. That would be my view, sir. You referred to, which is obviously the ideologically motivated violent extremism inspired attacks. Would you include in that? You mentioned the incel attacks and various other ones. Would you include that the coming to arrest the prime minister by crashing with a pickup through the Rideau gates with a heavily armed pickup truck and seeking to arrest the prime minister because of gun legislation that the person disagreed with? Would that be considered an ideological motivated violent extremist approach? And would that be something that would be considered a priority investigation by the RCMP, for example?
That's an excellent question, but it's not one that the committee turned its collective mind to, Mr. Harris. The timelines for this report, I don't think included, if I recall, perhaps Mr. Jorgensen could confirm. I don't recall if it included that particular event.
Does it seem to you, sir, to fall into that category? I mean, I'm not asking for
it may very
I'm not
well.
asking for CSIS's assessment or the RCMP assessment. What about yours?
It may very well, but I can't comment with credibility. I don't have the information that backstops whatever investigations taking place with respect to that particular.
But that would come under the rubric of a security threat of some kind to the country, where the prime minister, someone is trying to arrest the prime minister based on the activities that are publicly known. It's no secret. I mean, you don't need an investigation to know what was going on there.
Right.
But that would be a security threat to the country, would it not?
I would think it would be a security threat that our security and intelligence folks would be paying very close attention to, yes.
Tell me, we see that in other countries who have similar bodies such as yours, they, like the UK, for example, gives out a report noting the amount of efforts that are devoted to particular topics, such as we've been told that the UK report talks about the allocation of effort of MI5, which is similar to CSIS, and says that as of March 18th, they were devoting 67% of its efforts to investigating and disrupting Islamist terrorism. Do you think it would be useful and helpful for your committee to be assessing that kind of effort, so we would have an idea as members of parliament and the public as to what effort is being placed against particular activities? Is that something you would consider doing in the future?
It may very well be something that the committee considers. One of the opportunities coming for Parliament soon enough is the 5-year review of the statute that creates the committee. That may very well be something that the House may want to debate or consider in the statutory authority. The ISC in Britain has a slightly different structure than ours. We choose topics based on a series of criteria that we arrived at early on when the committee was first created. And I think your question, which is really important, also raises, Mr. Harris, the question of recommendations, I think, from the committee to the government and whether the government is responding adequately or not. We said something about that as well in the report.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Unfortunately, your time's up.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Kirk, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. McGuinty for your work and leadership provided on this important file. The report notes that some ISIS sympathizers were not active combatants, but I imagine that most of those captured would make that claim. ISIS terrorists who participate in fundraising, planning, recruitment, and propaganda. And I'm sure that over COVID, a lot of this has been moved online, but I would suggest that that's a pretty big threat as well. With 61 individuals identified as having returned to Canada, have they faced repercussions for those crimes?
Well, that's a really important question, Mr. Kurek, and the committee obviously looked at this very closely, but did not review the issue of repatriating foreign fighters or the broader issue of extremist travelers as a part of this annual report. We do, of course, speak from paragraphs 24 forward. I think that's what you're alluding to the international terrorism environment. We have named the numbers. What we're presenting here is the accurate numbers, those who are detained, those who are at large, and those who are dead. The numbers remain unclassified, so we are in a position to do so. And that's as far as the committee was able to go in this particular area that you're raising.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. And this is, it deals with such interconnected and complex issues. I've noted that it's common to make mention of far right groups rather than calling them what they are, hate groups. And certainly, as I've watched conservative and liberal and other political parties, lives and whatnot, you see the comments. There's hate coming from all sides, and it is absolutely tragic. Is there any distinction from your experience between hate groups and the groups that the report calls ideologically motivated violent extremists? Is there a differentiation?
I know that there's a debate around the nomenclature and the choice of words to describe these.
Je sais qu'il y a un débat très important sur ces définitions et toutes les nuances qu'ils contiennent. Nous avons un collègue qui est en train de dépister tout cela pour.
Yeah, and can you repeat that, perhaps?
Yeah, so can we back up on that, Mr. McGuinty, and just start your response in English again, please?
Sure. I'm saying to Mr. Kurek that there's an important debate, I understand, around the nomenclature and the language that is appropriate. I think Mr. Jorgensen would be best placed to give us an idea now of where that lies and whether that's something that has reached the committee for deliberation. I do not recall, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, Mr. Kirk. So I think there's a very clear distinction between extremists and over time, extremists have been identified as being everything from promoting women's rights to equality for Black people in the United States, for example. So there's that very clear distinction between that and people who then take any type of extremist position into a violent realm. And so this is where I think that CSIS has worked very hard with its international allies and partners to essentially focus on the behavior and not necessarily the motivation. So we know that it's ideological. That's what makes it, for example, terrorism. But I see your point that it's not right wing, it's not left wing. It is what's the violent basis for that behavior.
All right. And my last question, and I'll try to kind of squeeze two in here. One is espionage related to Canada's research institutions, and you've noted it in paragraph 55 as a major target for foreign espionage, and certainly in the midst of COVID, we've seen a changing dynamic related to that. So that's my first question, and then my next question is specific to the protection of our democratic institutions and the integrity of the electoral process, and certainly just the need to ensure that our elections are protected, so that Canadians can trust that foreign interference is identified and stopped. Because of course we read the headlines, but it's often the more clandestine operations or and with the proliferation of online issues, certainly there's that threat. So I'm wondering if you could, in the short amount of time that I'm sure that's available, kind of identify the threat to research institutions in that, and then also actions that could be taken or recommendations to whether that be Elections Canada or law enforcement regarding the protection of our democracy.
Mr. Couric has stretched his 5 minutes quite magnificently. Mr. McGuinty, could you respond to those very important questions in less than 30 seconds?
I'll do my best. Paragraph 45 onwards for members and for Canadians describes this question of espionage in the science and technology field. We talk about the Thousand Talents program. We talk about the threat from Russia and China. We talk about new technologies being increasingly the focus and targeted by foreign states. And we talk about the risk to critical infrastructure, our electricity grid and beyond. On the question of electoral integrity, that's precisely why, Mr. Couric, we as a committee focus so heavily on the Jim Judd report to assess whether or not the mechanism that was put in place by the government, a 5-person panel to deal with foreign interference, cyber in nature primarily, be expanded. We've made 4 or 5 recommendations to include, for example, in-person, more traditional foreign interference, so that would be caught. We also made some recommendations as to how that would be communicated to Canadians if there were an occurrence, Mr. Chair, because this would happen in the context of a usually heated and usually partisan campaign context, healthy and normal. But we want to make sure that if this was to occur, as it has occurred in the United States and other jurisdictions, we're best prepared to deal with it.
Thank you, Mr. McGuinty. Neither you nor I know anything about partisanship. Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes, please.
15 minutes? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, I was getting excited.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Mr. McGuinty for being here. I've been on a lot of committees and sat in front of an awful lot of testimony, and I have to tell you that none have been as exciting, frightening, terrifying as some of the testimony that we're hearing from you. So thank you very much for the work that you do on behalf of your committee. I also want to just a quick little kudos to the members of this committee as well. I'm a new member of this committee, but I have to tell you that very insightful questions, very respectful dialogue, and I'm nothing but impressed with this committee since becoming a new member. Kudos to the chair, of course, for handling things in such a professional way.
Okay, get to your question, will you, Mr. Fisher?
Yeah. Mr. McGuinty, in your report, your committee's report, you referenced the terror code listings process. So before 2019, there were no ideologically motivated violent extremist groups listed as territory entities, and now there are 6 white supremacist organizations, including, of course, the Proud Boys. Now, during your conversation with MP Michaud, you also said something about 100 organizations. Then you said that you believe that there may be as many as 300. I'm interested in your opinion on what impact does a listing process have?
Again, it's not something that the committee examined directly, Mr. Fisher. But I think it's fair to say that listing a group is exposing a group. It is making more available to the Canadian people information about some of the activities that these groups pursue, what's at risk, which is what we've tried to capture in this report based on the classified information we've received on this front. But listing, and it's not just one government that's listed, there have been other governments that have listed, and it's an important tool. But the proliferation of these groups is what I think also surprised us. It's the quantum leap in numbers that really had us as a committee together. And we have a member of this NSECOP committee on the Public Safety Committee, in Mr. Motz, who will recall we all sort of shook our collective heads, and we thought at first it was a misprint, but this rapid increase in IMVE is of significant concern.
Do you have any concern that by listing these groups that brings this relative fame, maybe encourages some groups to start the process, form groups?
I couldn't really say whether the infamy of it will drive people to participate or sign up. But I think in order for us as Canadians and parliamentarians to know what we're dealing with, I think we have to have this in the open. This is, I think, a core message of the committee in this report is this isn't going away. It's increasing. It's increasing in numbers. It's increasing in groups. It's increasing in online traffic. It's a source for recruitment. It's a source for radicalization. And it would be very helpful for parliamentarians, for Canada to build on some really important work that's going on now, Mr. Fisher, to try to understand why this is happening. And this is not just happening in Canada. The report sets out clearly it's happening globally. It's happening in the United States. It's happening in France, Germany, the UK. And so we're going to have to wrestle this to the ground and have a better understanding. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to give this important profile in the report.
How about online hate legislation like we see in Australia? Is that, do you see the benefit of taking action against this type of online violence before it has real world implications?
Not something the committee examined. It might very well be. It would be a very important issue for Public Safety Committee to examine. For example, would that be a contributing factor to help? But clearly, I guess I just want to repeat the message. This isn't going away. It's expanding in reach and size and scope and seriousness. And so I think we're going to have to deal with this now collectively.
And thank you, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I can't but make a link between cyber attacks and the pandemic that we're going through. You indicated that China and Russia have been upping the game in these attacks, cyber attacks, particularly by way of disinformation or misinformation campaigns. In Europe, we see that they've been fudging the numbers as to the vaccines, BioNTech, etc. Some emails have been hacked into and published on the dark web. I'm glad to see that we're increasing on our manufacturing capacity, because this is not the last pandemic we're going to see, and it's a very severe threat to the public. Absolutely. The impact on public health and impact on R&D in Canada, on the Canadian economy itself. It's far-reaching, it's widespread throughout the society. And we've tried to describe as clearly as possible paragraphs 65 to 67, 68, the actual happenings in that sector.
And sophistication of cyber threat actors is increasing. Second, CSC says state-sponsored programs from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea pose the greatest strategic threat to Canada, likely attempting to develop cyber capabilities to disrupt Canadian critical infrastructure, energy systems, water systems, our grid, traffic flow control. Third, it notes that state-sponsored actors continue to conduct commercial espionage against our businesses, academic and government, to steal intellectual property. And fourth, CSC tells us that online foreign influence campaigns are ongoing and are not limited to major political events like elections. Donc on voit que c'est un peu partout.
So we see that it's very widespread, and it has been described as accurately as possible for the parliamentarians and the Canadian public, so that they can better understand that it is throughout all economic sectors. It's in our universities and research centers and so forth.
Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. There's lots of questions to rise, but I do have to ask one overriding question having to do with the mandate of your committee. My understanding initially was that there was a great deal of interest in having an oversight of the various security and intelligence agencies that are operating in secret, as is their want, as is expected, and make sure that they're following their policies and their practices are in keeping with the law and accordance with the expectations of Canadians. What kind of activities have you undertaken in that regard? I know we were talking about threats here and threat assessments, but what about that oversight? What's been done in that area?
There was a debate, Mr. Harris, when this committee was first being contemplated in Parliament, of course. What is it? Is it an oversight committee, or which is perhaps a better description of the American congressional committees, the nature of those committees compared to a review committee, which NSECOP has become and is. The decision was taken by Parliament to make it a review body to look back over time with a broad mandate to be able to examine many, many issues and to get access to the classified information, ask the right questions, call in witnesses. Each review brings 10 to 30 or 40,000 pages of material. And then, of course, provide a report to the Prime Minister, as I mentioned, in classified form, have it redacted, and present it to Canadians. So we haven't really focused so much on the question of anything but review.
So if there's a question then of somebody misbehaving or doing something inappropriate, we, as a Parliament or as a country, have to revert to such things as like the O'Connor Commission or the Yakabuchi Commission, rather than ask NSECOP to deal with questions of whether or not these things are appropriate and what recourse individuals might have if they're handled badly in a negative way, as we've seen happen through security activities in the past.
Or that matter, those types of lawfulness questions, just-in-time lawfulness questions, can be dealt with by the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, NSERA.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Mr. Van Popta, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. McGuinty, for being here and telling us about your National Security and Intelligence Committee report for 2020. In this report, you highlight the growth, I think you say quantum growth, of what you're calling IMBE, ideologically motivated violent extremism. You've answered some questions about that already, so thank you for that clarification. But I'm trying to get a grip on how significant this growth is and whether individuals who are involved in these hate groups are identifiable, or whether, what's the nature of their communities? Are they just online communities, or are they real identifiable people? You make reference to a couple of geographical locations in Canada, like southern Alberta, southern Quebec, and somewhere in Ontario as well. So what's the nature of these groups?
Well, I think the report, Mr. Van Popta, has made it clear that obviously there's an online virtual community, which is growing in number, growing in number of groups and number of participants. But the security and intelligence organizations have indicated to us that there are clusters in the country. And so we've tried to represent that accurately. Beyond that, I don't know if I can offer any more detail in terms of the individuals or names and so on and so forth. Most of that would have been, of course, removed.
Would have been redacted. But I mean, I'm not looking for names, but there are identifiable individuals who are involved in this subversive activity in Canada.
Well, there is, and the concern the committee wanted to raise with Canadians is that this is a very large group. We found Canadians are highly active across 6,600 identified right-wing extremist channels, pages, groups, and accounts. 6,600. The study that we looked at also pointed to one prominent message board on which Canadians are more active than American or British users. What this means is that Canada has a very large base from which to recruit or from which to seek to radicalize participants. And that was a very big surprise to the committee as we received the information.
I think that's a very big surprise to all Canadians. It certainly is to me. I had not expected that. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. The report makes reference to a couple of incidences in other countries like New Zealand, right? The Christchurch shooting and a copycat shooting in El Paso. And I think there might have been one or two in Europe as well. Are there any indications of that type of event happening in Canada? I know there's reference also to the 3 in-cell motivated attacks in Canada. Any others that we should know about?
Any events that we were able to present to Canadians, Mr. Van Popta, for the period that we were reviewing, we have presented.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I just have one comment, and that is I want to put a motion to the meeting. I was so happy to see this report from the subcommittee on what we're going to study over the next couple of meetings. As a new member of the committee, I was getting quite frustrated that things were going so slowly, and I'm happy that we're getting close to the end of our study on systemic racism and on the parole board incident and on the Bastrash report. And so I'm so happy to see this report, and I would move a motion that the report be adopted. Thank you.
Okay. I would prefer not to deal with it at this point and prefer to deal with it at the end of Mr. McGuinty's testimony. And if that's acceptable to you, then we'll do that. With that, we're moving on to Madame Demoff. And 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. McGuinty, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here. As you know, I was on the Public Safety Committee when we studied Bill C-22, which created the committee. And it was my amendment that brought you here. So it's something that it was actually Matthew Dubé who reminded me of that in the last Parliament, that I was the one who had brought in that amendment. But I'm just sitting here so proud of the work that you and the other members of the committee have done, and just how important it is for you to share the report with all of us and with Canadians. So thank you for that. You know, when I was looking at the report, Mr. Van Popta was asking about, you know, what are these groups? And you had mentioned this earlier, but it's a form of extremism that encompasses xenophobic violence, anti-authority violence, gender-driven violence, and other grievance-driven. And then it talks about CSIS saying it's a common belief that the success or survival of society, civilization cannot be separated from the need for ongoing violence against a perceived threatening group. Example, the elite, visible minorities, religious groups, corporations, immigrants, capitalists, the government. And I have to say, I have noticed over the last 2 years, certainly an increase in the tone of comments that I see online and on posts that I make. And I was really disturbed in the report, and you just mentioned it when you mentioned how many Canadians, the report that you mentioned from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue said Canadians are highly active across 6,600 identified right-wing extremist channels, pages, groups, and accounts. And since they tend to organize online, it means that these messages are spread quicker. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how this online presence is contributing, and maybe you can't comment on this, and that's okay if you can't, but how an online presence allows these messages from these IMVE groups to spread quickly.
I can't get into any more detail than is in the report on this, but let me maybe repeat a few points. This rapid growth of IMVE is of very significant concern for Canadians, we believe. We believe this is true among our closest allies, and it's true in Canada. We've had enough comparative information classified as well, talking about what is going on in other places, and it's very, very concerning. These violent anti-authority groups, a number were recently listed as terrorist entities, including the Proud Boys, which apparently announced this week they were disbanding, I understand. But we've seen some unbelievable horrific crimes against women committed by individuals motivated by misogyny. We've seen the growth of neo-Nazi groups, groups espousing hatred against immigrants, against racialized communities, in the LGBTQ community. Anything we can do as parliamentarians to raise the profile of this new reality, this growing reality, and to find ways to address it, I think would be very, very, very welcome today.
So you mentioned in the report, and you touched on it now, how the pandemic has impacted the number of people who have been drawn to this. And I mean, the numbers you gave to us were actually frightening. 320% increase, and I suspect that number is even higher given the what you've seen during COVID. I just wondered if you could comment on that, please.
Not much to add, except to say that what we tried to do in the report was to apply a COVID lens at the end of each of the 5 core threat areas to say, well, what really has happened here under the COVID-19 pandemic? And it appears that the evidence indicates that it's pushing activity online, more subterfuge, more connectivity inside the country, between countries. I think Mr. Jorgensen could add a little bit more to that, Ms. Dema, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would just make 2 points. The one is the monitoring of extremism and how that is being pushed underground. And you would recognize, of course, that the security intelligence organizations don't necessarily monitor extremism per se, because being an extremist is not, it may be vile speech, but it's not illegal. And it is actually identifying when that extremism becomes violent. And I think that's the second point I would make, is that the S&I community, security intelligence community, has been very clear. It is very difficult in this environment to identify someone who has become radicalized, and then the time that takes then to become violent. And that time frame has reduced considerably, and I know that that's something that security intelligence organizations really struggle with, and that actually gets to your first point. What is the impact of that online hatred? And I think that that's one of the key issues.
Thank you, Madame Dema. Colleagues, that brings us over the hour that is allocated to Mr. McGuinty. I note that he is quite popular and members are quite keen, and Mr. Motts had seemed to hope that we would go a little bit beyond normal. I'm in the hands of colleagues as to whether we have a third round or some partial expression of a third round. I see Mr. Couric seems to be enthusiastic. Pam?
Chair, I think it's important, given the testimony we've heard, that we deal with the motion that you got, the 1064 today. So I would say no to a third round.
Mr. Harris?
Well, I was going to speak in the other direction and suggest that we do have a third round. I don't think we're going to need all the rest of the time to deal with either the 106 motion or the motion from the subcommittee.
Madame Michaud.
I agree with Mr. Harris. I agree with a third round.
Okay. Based on that, I think we will have a third round. I'll just possibly, in light of Madame Dema's comments, we'll just chop it in half. And it'll be 2.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes, a minute, 2.5 minutes, 2.5 minutes. I'm assuming that's all right with you, Mr. McGuinty?
That's fine, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Therefore, I'm looking for a representative of the Conservative Party for 2.5 minutes. And then the Liberal Party. I didn't know that anybody was that shy.
Hi, Mr. Chair. We're just trying to figure out a little bit of a surprise, which is never a bad thing. So thank you very much for this and the committee's willingness. Specifically, Mr. McGuinty, regarding organized crime and the fact that it seems, both from this report and other things that I've read, that Canada has become a haven for money laundering. International crime groups are using Canada to launder up to $100 billion a year, and this seems to be a fraction of the massive amounts laundered per year globally, but still a significant issue. Is money laundering a symptom of a growing number of criminal organizations, or a product of the lack of concentration on this issue, or a combination of both?
Mr. Kurek, I think it's a combination of both. Okay. And the report from paragraph 87 forward lays out the nature of what is happening, some of the changes, what's happening in the drug trade, what's happening with money laundering, the extent of that money laundering, the example of what took place in British Columbia in terms of the casinos, BC real estate. We highlight what's been happening in the Greater Toronto area in terms of real estate and its connection to money laundering. So we've tried to put this out, as well as this question of trade-based laundering, to explain what the magnitude of this challenge is, and whether or not FinTrack, the organization that is seized with this ostensibly, does not necessarily have the legislative authority to collect a certain amount of information it would need. So we've laid this out in pretty clear paragraphs to point out exactly what you raised, which is another growing area, and it's something I believe we may end up addressing. I can't prejudge, but as I said earlier, the committee is going to be pursuing a review of the federal policing mandate of the RCMP.
You have less than 30 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and I would follow up. You half answered this question, but certainly there's some complications between the investigative authority of the RCMP, FinTrack, and then our intelligence agencies. So that coordinated approach is something that hasn't been looked at, but something that may need to be looked at going forward. Then is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
I think that's a fair statement. Absolutely.
Okay. 2.5 minutes for the Liberal.
Thank
question.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Andropoulos. Okay.
So thank you very much, Mr. McGuinty and team, for being here with us today to answer our questions, and thanks for the work that you do on this committee to protect Canadians. My question is about the spike in online hate and online hate groups. I can't help but notice the concern that people have with Bill C-10 and with people's belief that it would infringe on basic, rights to express themselves and freedom of expression, which obviously our government has said it wouldn't do. But because this is the current fear, I'm wondering how our government could go forward. What you would recommend, or ways that you could see our government going forward with legislation to stop people who do organize hatred online and push that kind of an agenda on social media and online in order to kind of stop them. What ways can we help these groups or limit the ability of these groups to have a negative influence on Canadians?
I think you're raising, Ms. Lambropoulos, the $64,000 question. What is the appropriate balance between free speech and when that free speech crosses a line and becomes something else? It's not something the committee examined in terms of what's the remedy, what's the recommendation. In fact, this report was agnostic this year on recommendations. It wanted to present the magnitude of the risks. But we really hope that a committee like Public Safety, for example, might apply its collective mind to figure out what is the best way forward. We haven't examined C-10. It's being debated, but we haven't applied it to this particular set of challenges. But we may have more to say about this when we release our report on cyber activities, which we hope will be by the summer. And we may also have more to say about this when we are finished the review of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's federal policing mandate. given their role, the national organization with primary responsibility for national security investigations and organized crime, for example.
Thank you, Mrs.
Thank you.
Lambropoulos. Madame Michaud, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your report, there's talk of organized crime and how organized crime is more and more complex, but that the nature of the threat hasn't really changed since 2018. This is a major problem in Montreal. There was a young woman, a 15-year-old woman, that was killed in a shootout. Someone probably had an illegal weapon. There was someone else who was arrested with 250 weapons, trying to import them from the United States. With all the information that you have on organized crime, is Canada doing enough to fight the illegal arms trade? Once again, this is something that the committee looked at directly, but this is an issue that will probably be reviewed when the committee looks into what's going on at the RCMP and the RCMP's mandate to conduct national police activities. But in our report, we didn't at all look into those issues directly.
Mr. Harris, 1 minute. You're on mute, Jack.
Thought I just fixed that. Sorry. In paragraph 71 and 72 of your report, you talk about Russia, China, and Iran having demonstrated intention to develop cyber attack capabilities. At the end of it, however, after suggesting that the Russians are already there, the CSIS notes, in the absence of a major crisis or armed conflict with Canada or the US, the intentional disruption of Canadian critical infrastructure remains unlikely. I don't know what that's supposed to mean and whether you agree with that or not. Surely it's only in a crisis that these types of things would happen. Are we up to the defense for that? Or do you evaluate that kind of a statement, or do you just repeat it here?
If I could, Mr. Harris, could I ask Mr. Jorgensen to respond to you directly on that?
Sure.
Sure. I mean, I guess the issue, it was in fact a CSE, Communication Security Establishment assessment, and that is that this type of activity goes on all the time. In fact, we see it with some of our allies in the Middle East who do the same thing, not necessarily in the crisis. And so that similar thing could happen in Canada. And however, the assessment of CSE is that the intention of a major state actor would be only displayed in the circumstance of a war.
Thank you. The next question will be a conservative. I don't know who the conservative is for the 2.5 minutes.
I can go.
Okay, Mr. Van Popta, 2.5 minutes.
Chair. Okay, so thank you, Mr. McGinty again, and for raising the issue of malicious cyber activity. I was very interested to hear what you had what your report has to say there, and also have to admit very, very alarmed. So this is foreign entities breaking into our security and stealing our intellectual property. So my question is really about that. How big of a threat is that of foreign entities, foreign companies, let's say, controlled by foreign governments, stealing our intellectual property and in that way threatening us economically?
So, Mr. Van Popta, in the report from paragraph 61 forward, 4 or 5 paragraphs in a row, we described that threat quite clearly. And the committee was unanimous, as it is behind all these paragraphs, that it wanted to name specifically China, the Russian Federation, Iran, and the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. CSE's information, which we present here, says they continue to see cyber activity consistent with each actor's national strategic objectives, including in cyber activity against Canadian government networks, private sector systems, and critical infrastructure systems. So we do know, we've looked at enough evidence to conclude that China and Russia to continue to be the main drivers of cyber threat activity, targeting the government since 2018, since we last looked at this. And it's focusing across a whole series of government sectors. I just can't go into any more detail than that.
Of course, no, fair enough. No, thank you for that. So are these state-owned enterprises controlled by the Chinese Communist government or the Russian government, or are they private actors, or to what extent is it nation-to-nation issue?
Don't think I'm in a position to give you any more detail than the fact that the report refers to Chinese and Russian actors.
No, fair enough. I respect that. Thank you. Is that my time?
Yep, you're pretty well done.
Thank you.
You are now. Final 2.5 minutes to the roll questioner. Failing which, I'll take it if no one else will.
Why don't you take it, Chair?
Okay. Mr. McGuinty, first of all, thank you for coming. And you've, I think, only hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of the overall threat assessment, and you have some limitations. I would like you to delve into the nature of the threat to our democracy. We saw in the last 4 years that the Russians were very successful in setting Americans off against each other, exaggerating the differences, if you will, and imperiling the actual expression of an American democracy. So I'd be interested in how you see both the Russian and the Chinese activities and how they operate to threaten our democracy. What's in specificity, in some specificity, please.
I wish I could be, Mr. Chair, more specific. We've been as specific as we possibly can be in the report, in the Canadian context. But I would repeat that the evidence indicates that this is happening in the context of every political party in this country at all levels of government. It's about the deployment of individuals on Canadian soil directed by a foreign state actor. I would point committee members and Canadians to paragraph 70 and 74 as an example of the extent to which a foreign actor will go. We lay out what has ostensibly happened in the likely launching of a cyber attack against the Australian Parliament and its three largest political parties prior to the Australian general election, likely by China, in early 2019. We then go on to describe what happened in June 2020 when China likely conducted another large-scale cyber attack against Australia and Australian companies, hospitals, schools, and government officials. And in the case of the United States, in paragraph 74, since our report was published, the U.S. Justice Department and Homeland Security confirmed that their voting machines weren't necessarily tampered with, but Russia clearly tried to influence the election by using sophisticated online disinformation campaigns. So we've captured that in the report to point out the nature and the extent and the level to which some state actors will go to disrupt the democracy that we have, which is why we made 4 or 5 major recommendations to the Prime Minister around this panel, 5-person panel, that is there to help blow the whistle if and when major irregularities would occur during a Canadian election. And we think that should be expanded. We think the membership should be varied. And we think the way in which Canadians are informed should be handled very carefully.
Thank you for the limitations to your answer. I understand it, but it's also frustrating to not understand the nature and extent of the threat to both our economy and our democracy in a more specific way. But thank you for your presentation. As you can see, there's a huge appetite in the members for the work of your committee. And I think on behalf of the members of the Public Safety Committee, not only you and Mr. Jorgensen are to be thanked, but if you'd also thank the other members of Parliament who have joined you, including our Mr. Motz, who I'm sure has contributed to your deliberations. So thank you. And with that, we'll suspend for a minute or two to let Mr. McGuinty and Mr. Jorgensen leave, and then ask Madame Demoff to present her emergency motion, and then we'll deal with the subcommittee's report. So suspend for 2 minutes. Is that good enough, Mr. Clerk? Okay.
In this meeting. Now, maybe it wasn't ruled out of order, it was just postponed. So I think that motion is on the floor, sir. That would be my understanding.
Well, we can, but the emergency motion may also trump in positioning the any other motions that are on the floor. But if there can be a collegial way to work this out, I'm perfectly happy to do that.
I'm not sure the intent of the emergency motion was to supersede everything else the committee is doing. Maybe Pam can enlighten us about that.
Pam?
Thanks, Chair. And actually, yes, it does, Jack. The date in the motion, as you see, is to begin a study immediately, no later than May the 10th. I think it would be wise to do the work plan after we've debated the 1064, because especially after what we've heard from the testimony today from Mr. McGuinty and all of us who've read the report, I think his words were that this is a very serious matter for Canadians. It's a very serious matter for parliamentarians. And, you know, when we get to debating the 1064, I will speak to it more, but I do think we would be wise to wait to deal with the work plan until we've dealt with that. But if the other members don't want to do that, then so be it.
Christina, then Shannon.
Je voulais juste prendre la parole après sur le...
I just wanted to say a few words about 1064, but since we're not dealing with it right away, I'll wait.
Well, Chair, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think actually that the 1064 motion hadn't been moved yet. The motion for the adoption of the subcommittee report was moved first, and so it actually is the first thing we should deal with.
I'm delighted to correct you if you're wrong, but I'm happy to deal with both in whatever order. But I think Pam does make a very good point that if the committee does choose to adopt the 1064, then we should and that would potentially affect the work plan report. So I don't see any other. Glenn. Glenn, you need to put your microphone down.
Apologies. Chair, I would just point out that I agree with Mr. Harris and my colleague Shannon on the need to let's deal with the motion that's on the floor. Then let's have the conversation about 106.4. It may not be as difficult as what I suspect some might anticipate. There is a lot of things that we have to finish, and as there's a lot of comments that I'm sure we all have with respect to the motion, Pam's motion, and the 106.4 in regards to this and how we proceed with it. And I will leave the comments specific to it for then. But I would say that let's deal with the adoption of the motion that's on the floor, and then let's deal with Pam's motion that has yet to be moved. It's a letter to the committee, and that would be the proper procedure, Chair. And I would confer that to the clerk if that is any other way to do it. Pam.
Let's just vote on the motion that's on the floor, Chair.
Okay. So the motions on the floor is to accept the subcommittee report as presented by the committee. Jack.
So I see that the item number 1 on the report, the one referring to the consolidation of certain motions, I believe the motion under, or the section C of that was in fact modified during the subcommittee meeting that we held, and that sub C, reports of sexual coercion and violence by officers against female inmates, was actually changed to reports of sexual coercion and violence in federal prisons. Pam, if you can confirm that. Pam is confirming that because we did discuss it as a committee, and the consensus
I had the same note, Jack.
So if that can be amended, I don't know if we need a move that we amend this report to remove the words by officers against female inmates and replace it with the words in federal prisons.
I think the clerk already has taken note of that. Is an agreement that correction be made, or that change be made to the report? Okay, any other debate about the report as amended? Those in favor of accepting the report as, Christina, did you want to debate further?
Je voulais juste savoir si on avait accès à la...
Have we access to the written motion? I do not remember having read, or perhaps with this new amendment. I just like to make sure what we're voting on.
Correction to section C of paragraph 1 to amend it in the way in which Mr. Harris wanted it amended, and the subcommittee report was sent out to all members.
C'est bon, je l'ai sous les yeux. Merci. Tout est beau.
Okay.
Yes, I found it in the meantime. Thank you, Chair.
Jack, your hands.
Yeah, I have another point. Thanks. Yeah, Chair.
Hang on. Before, are you making an additional point, or I thought we were asking for a vote at this point? You're muted again. Jack, your lips are moving.
No, this is by way of debate, sir.
About the report?
About the report, yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought we'd already were asking for a vote as amended. Okay.
Yeah, well, I wanted to amend it, but I just want a clarification on item number 7. It's stated as the committee should commence its study on the management and control of Canadian borders opening and closure and the government directives issued following the study on the Correctional Services of Canada. I think that's there was a bit of a nuance to that in terms of what the committee had decided, and it may influence people's decision as to whether to support this report. but the intention was that given the fact that there had been an Auditor General's directive and report since the pandemic had occurred, and that there was needed to be a little bit of time to determine whether perhaps that we should evaluate whether those directives had been followed or worked. I believe that was Pam's suggestion, and I think it was on that basis that it was agreed that we might have a single meeting sometime after, not on May 27th or whatever date that was proposed, but give it a little time, and that we would pick a date to have a meeting to do that evaluation. So that doesn't seem to me to be the same as saying we shall commence the study that was proposed by the motion that Madame Michaud had proposed some time ago. So I think that's a nuanced understanding that we had.
Okay, can I call in our clerk at this point, who is much more up on this than I am. You had an amendment or a clarification, Mark?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if the committee is so inclined, we could always add a reference to specifically the Auditor General's report that was indeed discussed on Monday.
So would you put that in after Correction Services Canada or government? Where would you put that?
Si je peux me permettre, Monsieur le Président, comme...
If I may, Mr. Chairman, since that would be just one meeting, it might be put before the correctional services, which would give the necessary time to the various agencies to give us answers.
Well, first of all, let's deal with where the clerk would propose putting this clarification in, and then we can debate it from there. So how would it read in your opinion, Mark?
Well, if I understand correctly, if the committee's desires for a meeting to look at the Auditor General's report on the border management issues during the COVID-19 pandemic, we can just phrase it that way.
So the committee committee have one meeting on the management and control of candidates boards? I'm not quite sure I'm following this.
Sorry, the committee meet or the committee have a meeting to discuss the Auditor General's or invite the Auditor General, or however the committee wants to do it, because the discussion involved seeing what the fallout of the Auditor General's report would be after that time had elapsed. So it's a question of how they wish to frame it. The discussion was within the context of the study that was agreed to by the committee last fall regarding the border situation regarding the pandemic.
I recall a conversation. I don't recall whether this captures the conversation, though, Pam.
Yeah, it was to have one meeting. I thought it was to discuss the Auditor General's response, or the Auditor General and the response to that report on the management and control of the borders.
Is that sense of the subcommittee members, Jack?
Yes, it was certainly. I think what we talked about is that there was an Auditor General's report, and that that's fairly new, and that it would be useful to understand whether or not the government had improved things or done anything to fix what was the problems identified, and that perhaps that to do it right away might be too soon. Like if we waited till the second week in June, or the end of the first week in June, or something like that, we might be able to get a proper assessment as to whether or not things had improved or changed. Not trying to put it off, just to provide enough of a gap to allow that to happen. If the committee believes that we're ready to do that now, not to hear from the Auditor General, but to find out whether or not the Auditor General's recommendations have been in fact implemented or taken into account. I don't know if we need to hear from the Auditor General in that regard. We just look at his report, presumably.
I'm a little lost on
Hear
what
from
our
witnesses.
framing should be. So is it that the committee dedicate one meeting to the study and management of the control of Canada's borders following the Auditor General's report?
Yeah, in light of
the Auditor General's report? That captured, Shannon?
Sorry, I think I'm probably not going to be like magically solve this issue here, except just to reiterate that what Jack has said is exactly my recollection of the discussion at subcommittee, that we, Christina and I certainly were suggesting that we should move very quickly on studying that issue because how of the significant impact it has on the everyday lives of Canadians and is an urgent issue in real time right now. But I know that Pam didn't want to go to that study soon and was wondering why we would do that. And so then I had said the
meeting was in
Jack
camera.
has said.
Just point of order, Chair.
Yes, we are.
Oh, okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, we don't discuss what members said in camera.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I apologize. Although, yeah, so we just have been, I guess, for 5 minutes. But so then the conclusion was that since the Auditor General report has no, I'm trying to be careful. Since the Auditor General report has clarified that there have been problems in terms of border management and a lack of training, this is all public, right? And a lack of training and clarity for border agents managing the border during COVID, that then just in order to, we agree that just in order to allow for action to be taken, that then June or after the rest of this schedule, as Jack has said, that then we would meet to examine what progress or changes have been made.
Christina?
Donc, pour faire simple, je pense que comme vous l'avez dit, Monsieur le Président.
Well, as you said, Chair, we could simply call for one meeting to study this issue of the management at the borders. Just one meeting. That's all we're looking for. And we can flesh out the details. If we have to do it now, I don't know, but one meeting will be set aside for this issue. That's all we're getting at.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Just one meeting to look at it, Chair, is fine.
Okay, so how would we frame paragraph 7 then? That the committee have one meeting to study the management and control of Canada's borders? Is that fine?
I think in light of the Auditor General's report would be fine. You don't necessarily need.
Okay, do you want to start the sentence with, in light of the Auditor General's report, that the committee have one meeting to study the opening and closing of Canada's borders? Is that
with me.
Good enough? Okay. Okay.
Should we just make reference to the date of the the Auditor General's report, so that we know that we have the right one?
I don't know what the the date is, but
I'm sure we'll find it. Not a big deal. I'll withdraw that comment.
He can't be making that many reports on the border.
I'm sure we'll find the relevant one.
Okay, so as the amendments have been put forward, is there a will to accept the subcommittee's report? Okay, seeing no objections and the unanimous enthusiasm of the committee to accept the subcommittee's report, that's dealt with. And the final item is the emergency motion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pam.
Thanks, Chair. And I think all of us are upset and troubled by what we heard from Mr. McGuinty, and when we read his report. So as a result, the Liberal members have asked for a we've sent to you a letter under Standing Order 1064. And I just, in the letter, CSIS in their report in 2020 said that, and I quote, since 2014, Canadians motivated in whole or in part by their extremist ideological views have killed 21 people and wounded 40 others on Canadian soil, more than religiously motivated violent extremism or politically motivated violent extremism. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated xenophobic and anti-authority narratives, many of which may directly or indirectly impact national security considerations. Violent extremists continue to exploit the pandemic by amplifying false information about government measures and the virus itself on the internet. Some violent extremists view COVID-19 as a real but welcome crisis that could hasten the collapse of Western society. Other violent extremist entities have adopted conspiracy theories about the pandemic in an attempt to rationalize and justify violence. These narratives have contributed to efforts to undermine trust in the integrity of government and confidence in scientific expertise. While aspects of conspiracy theory rhetoric are legitimate exercise in free expression, online rhetoric that is increasingly violent calls for the arrest and execution of specific individuals is of increasing concern. So that's from the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service. And we just heard from Mr. McGuinty, the chair of NSECOP, about the very serious and striking thing about the review to him was this exact rise in the short form is IMVE. I mean, a 320% increase in the number of groups. So, we are the Public Safety Committee. I think in light of the information, we sent this letter prior to Mr. McGuinty's testimony, but in light of his testimony, I think it makes it even more urgent for the committee that is seized with looking after the safety of the public, that we do vote in favor of this. And, I can't help think about, I think it was Mr. Harris who asked about the gentleman who tried to breach Rideau Hall to arrest the Prime Minister. His leader, Jagmeet Singh, was subjected to someone who followed him last summer, making threats. And Mr. Singh in the House said that the government needs to use all available tools to address the proliferation of white supremacist and hate groups. And in fact, it was his motion in the House that had called for the Proud Boys to be listed as a terrorist entity. So this is not a partisan issue at all, but it is one that is of extreme concern to Canadians. There are real world threats that are out there right now. And I know that other committees in Parliament have studied online hate. There was a study about anti-racism that was done by the Heritage Committee in 2018. Those are very, very different issues. Those were the Heritage Committee dealt with the rise of racism and how to deal with that many of the recommendations were community-based. The Justice Committee in 2019 looked at online hate. But this is much different and much more urgent. And it's a threat to Canadians. And I think it's incumbent upon us as the committee that is seized with ensuring that we're looking at urgent issues for Canadians, that we do in fact review this. So Chair, I want to move this motion that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security immediately begin a study no later than May the 10th into ideologically motivated violent extremism in Canada, that the study consists of 4 meetings, that the committee invite representatives from our national security agents and those who have been impacted by IMVE, that the committee report its findings to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response to the report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Christina, debate?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Pam, pour le dépôt de cette motion.
Thank you very much for presenting this motion, Pam. This is a very urgent and important subject that we should deal with. But I note that it becomes quite frustrating in the long term because as a committee, we had agreed on a number of motions. They were voted, for most part, on a consensus basis, almost unanimous in most cases. We didn't agree, we didn't arrange any schedule as to which would come first for various reasons. So we're still dealing with the systemic racism and of course, we're trying to establish a priority for this issue now. And I'm finding it a bit frustrating. Jack and myself, well, it's part of the democratic process, of course. If we had more members of our parties here, we'd probably be doing the same strategy so that our motions would take the lead and that we study them immediately. So we had agreed on the motion for Mr. Lightmound, which was very similar on online hate. It's not identical, but it was quite similar. It has been studied in other committees. That's an argument that's put forward often enough. We often propose a motion and we say, well, that's been dealt with by such and such a committee. So despite all that, I think this is an important motion. I would propose an amendment to the motion, if I may, rather that we immediately study the issue. We can do it immediately after we've dealt with the 3 reports that we have in hand. Well, you can name the reports if you want in the amendment, or that this study be undertaken as soon as the committee has terminated its current slate of reports. This might bring us to the end of May or early June, and I think that would be quite reasonable to proceed in that fashion, because if we drop everything else to do this, we're delaying the other reports, which are of significance and importance as well. I'll try to make it a friendly amendment, if I may, Pat.
The amendment is?
No, I'm not prepared to amend it like that, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, so when we come to voting, it'll be the amendment first, and then the main motion. But the debate will continue on the amendment, which will probably slop over into the other.
Sorry, point of order. Can I get the specific amendment read out just to make sure that we're all on the same page?
I think. Well, okay. Let Christina. Can you be specific? It's really a change in time.
Oui. Donc, on pourrait biffer.
Well, strike the word immediately, but in keeping with the motion that we begin a study, or undertake a study, after dealing with the current reports of the committee. So we strike out the word immediately, basically, to begin a study. Immediately begin a study. Just remove the, I don't know quite clearly how to draft it, Mr. Chairman, but that the intent is to strike out immediately. Do it after the reports.
And if the phrasing immediately be struck.
Juste pour clarification, Madame Michaud, est-ce que vous...
For clarification, Ms. Michaud, are you talking about the work of the committee or the reports of the committee? Well, the reports on systemic report, racism rather, and the death of a young woman in prison. So, well, Ms. Levesque, in other words. I think those are the ones that we're working on right now, is it not? So you're referring specifically to the reports that are in process. Yes, exactly.
Striking the word immediately and this not be dealt with until all of the reports are dealt with. That's the sense of it. Okay. That cleared everyone. Joelle, Jack, Shannon, Glenn. Oh my goodness.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais essayer d'être.
I'll try to be as quick as possible, Mr. Chair. respond to Member Michaud's comments. Yes, there's an overlap with the motion I put forward, but I was talking about online hate and extremism. I think was given a priority after systemic racism in the case of the death of Ms. Levesque. There is a difference, however, because what's been presented by 1064 before the committee treats specifically on the extreme violence ideologically motivated. And that is what it was the most striking in the report that we've just heard here. The extreme rapid growth of the number of these groups and the significance of this violence. It just really calls us to look at this with some urgency. It's happening everywhere in the United States and Europe, the rise of these groups. I don't think there's another issue that's quite as pressing or urgent to draw attention to from a public safety point of view. So I would hope that we can support this motion. 4 meetings, 4 weeks perhaps, 1 meeting a week. And I think that we can provide some enlightened information for government action. It's very urgent, very pressing, as we've heard from the president of our group. It's a national threat. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I have to agree that with the urgency of the matter. We have heard obviously the recent testimony and the report, and I will say that I brought up the attack on Rideau Hall. He certainly attacked the gate. He didn't get to the Prime Minister to arrest him. Of course, he wasn't there. But there was also in Newfoundland and Labrador during the last election a gentleman who took it upon himself to take his he had a pickup as well. I don't know if there's any coincidence in that, but he was driving along driving with the intention to quote stop this election unquote. I showed up in front of a campaign headquarters in Deer Lake after having been chased and eluded the police along the way with 16 hunting rifles and various other things in his vehicle, and has been arrested and is being subject to charges. So we do have people seem to be motivated by, ideological of one sort or another motivations to take it upon themselves to do these things. It is a relatively new phenomenon, but not the notice of the phenomenon, but the extent of it that appears to give it a sense of urgency. But that doesn't mean, to me, urgent means maybe we should deal with it between now and the end of the session and find a way of doing that. To drop everything to do it and take up 4 meetings right away doesn't seem to me to make sense. So I'm not prepared to agree to that, but I will agree to undertake that study. Perhaps we can do it in conjunction with the other work that we've already committed to, and not necessarily take anything away from what's been put in place already.
Pam? Oh, sorry, not Pam. Shannon.
Thank you, Chair. So I just think the other edit that will have to be in terms of the timing would be striking the reference to May 10th, because when you look at the agenda circulated from the subcommittee, it would be on that Monday, May 10th, that we would be drafting instructions for the Marilyn Levesque report. So if Conservatives also have no problem with this motion and undertaking this important study. We, though, do share the same concerns about timing and completion of the work as it's been scheduled. So certainly do support Christina's motion regarding timing, but I think just that adjustment's going to have to be made to that to delete this no later than May 10th part, because we do have that in the schedule to be dealing with the Marilyn Levesque report.
colleagues, we started at 3:48. It's now 5:47. Without unanimous consent, I have to adjourn the meeting. In this case, if the meeting is adjourned without a debate on the motion, I'd have to bring it back at first available opportunity. I'm open to suggestions.
Can we move to a vote? There's an amendment, and then the.
Well, I don't think we can. I don't think we can move to a vote when there's still people wishing to speak. So, unfortunately, I think I have to adjourn unless I get unanimous consent to continue with this meeting.
Chair, are you not suspending? Because we're in the middle of debate on a motion. So are you not suspending?
Well,
the
I
meeting?
suspend the debate on the motion and adjourn the meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, and then to be brought up at the first opportunity. And ideally, there will be some conversations prior to the next meeting, which would be Monday.
So I think we suspend the meeting, though, Chair.
Sorry, point of order. Was there not unanimous consent? I'm okay personally with going forward. I didn't actually hear the question get asked, though.
I didn't see the unanimous consent to extend the time past 8:48 or 5:48.
Chair, if I can I make a comment, please?
Certainly.
Just in regards to suspending the meeting or adjourning it for a later date. I know we've been here a long time today, but I think to demonstrate the importance of this particular motion and the whole idea of extremism being looked at and addressed in a timely way. I'm in favor of continuing on. I don't think it's going to take terrible long to get through this. My hand is still up for the Christina's amendment that I would like to speak to, but I'm certainly in favor of extending this until we get this resolved.
To get beyond 8:48, I have to have unanimous consent.
Chair, I'm not prepared to stay till we get this done because that could mean God knows what. But I am prepared to stay for the 10 minutes if we think that this can be resolved that quickly.
Okay, I still have to have unanimous consent to get past the time. I can see some thumbs, but not unanimous.
There's
no thumbs down. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, maybe you can ask if anybody's opposed to it because I don't see people opposing extending the meeting.
Okay, there's a better way to ask it. Any opposed? We'll make it 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Good enough? Okay. Okay. Glenn, you're up.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank Christina for the. First of all, thank Pam for the motion, as well as my comments about needing to get at the whole all forms of extremism, and we need to deal with that. A couple of things as far as timing. I think that I'd certainly like to honor the decisions of the subcommittee, and would propose a friendly amendment to Christina's motion or to her amendment, but I just want to bring out a couple things. This is an important study, and I want to preface that before I say what I'm going to say. In the last 5 years, there's been 2,800 plus shootings in Toronto alone, not the GTA, in Toronto alone. There's been 361 people injured in that time, those shootings, and there has been over 82 people killed in that time. So as far as emergency debates, there is a lot of things that are emergent that are affecting Canadians immediately. They are no more important or no less important than this particular study. But we also have other studies that are on our agenda. And I would suggest that we can continue on with the agenda we have, which goes until, if I'm correct, it goes until the beginning of June, at which time we can then move into 4 meetings, whatever we decide with this particular motion. And we are still going to be timely. we're still going to be responsible to a very important issue. So what I'm proposing, Christina, if you're amicable to a friendly amendment to your amendment, is that we strike the no later than May 10th, and then we add into the way the motion reads, ideologically motivated extremism, violent extremism in Canada, following the conclusion of the other work already scheduled by the May 3rd subcommittee report. That'll take us to May or June 2nd or 7th, whatever day that is, that everything that's on the subcommittee report that was decided on Monday goes ahead as planned. And then immediately following, we know what our marching orders is for the remainder of June. If you're amicable to that, that would be my comments on the amendment, Mr. Chair.
We have a lot of amendments floating around here. Christina, do you perceive that as a friendly amendment to your amendment, which wasn't friendly by virtue of Pam saying it wasn't friendly in the first place?
Absolument, oui, c'est parfait.
Yep, that's fine.
But the motion sub-amendment isn't friendly at this point. Takeo, then Emanuela, and Jack. Okay.
Good, thank you. I'll be as quick as I can. I want to echo what others have said, that I think that this is a very important study, and I'm happy for our committee to undertake it, but I am concerned about the timing for all the reasons that others have said. We've got so many projects on the go right now. A number of them are almost at the finish line. Let's push them over the finish line before we take on another project. And that's what I also want to echo what Glenn had said about gang violence. He cited some statistics out of Toronto. Well, it's hitting pretty close to home. There have been 2 shootings in my hometown of Langley just in the last little while, gang-related, gangland-style killings in broad daylight in shopping malls. Another one in Delta, close by, was a police officer. This is a real and present danger, and Canadians are very concerned. And I've told many people that I've spoken to that the Public Safety Committee is going to be studying gang violence very soon.
Point of order, Chair. Are we not debating the amendment on the floor?
Yeah, we are debating the amendment and we're debating the motion. And yes, okay. I let Glenn wander off on gang violence, and now I'm letting Takeo wander off on gang violence.
Timing. Important.
Yeah,
it's all about timing. It's all about it's in the timing. I agree with the motion.
Okay, so the motion.
Thank you.
A motion subject to amendment to take it up after. Well, basically after the subcommittee report, which is, I think, finishes around June the 2nd. Is that somewhere? That's what we've agreed to, is June 2nd at this point?
It's much longer than that, Chair.
Longer than that.
It's much longer than that. It's till the end of June.
Okay, so we are at an impasse. Emanuela.
Yeah, essentially what we're saying here with the amendments is that we don't really want to study this. I definitely think that it's an important issue that we should study, and that I completely understand and agreed with Christina's original motion and amendment. Sorry, that we should do it after finalizing the reports on the work that we've already done. Absolutely. I don't see why we wouldn't finalize the work that we've done and table certain things in the House, but it's definitely a really important issue, and I thought that it would be important to do once those 2 reports have been tabled in the House and once we finalize them. Because with having read the subcommittee report and knowing how long it takes us to actually go through the different reports and to complete them and accept all of the recommendations, just judging by the policing study that we just finished, obviously we won't finish before the end of June all of the things that are listed on that agenda. So if we actually are serious about this being a serious topic that we want to study, I strongly encourage us to find a way forward and a way that makes sense, and not to say after the work that's listed in the subcommittee, because that won't allow us time to even begin this study.
Jack and Damien.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just looking at this with the subcommittee report here and thinking about this. We can't, I don't think we're prepared to abandon the studies that we've already started. I think we do have to finish reports. I think there's even in the amendment, there's room for flexibility as we move forward. I don't think, the consolidated study, we anticipated maybe 3 meetings. This study contemplates 4 meetings that might be able to be done in 3, because of what we're trying to do is bring the attention of the country to this issue in a greater way than has been done by Mr. McGuinty's appearance today. I think that is a laudable goal. I think the study, any study on the kind that's referred to as an additional study that Glenn is talking about is certainly it can't be done between now and the end of June, or a whole new study like that, particularly one of that extensiveness. So I think we don't have to drop everything to do this, and if we manage to finish the 15 minutes and have the meet again, maybe we can come up with some agreement between now and Monday to have some flexibility. I'm not sure it's going to take, by the way, two full hours for drafting instructions on the Levesque study. That's something that I wanted to sort of throw in there. I mean, it wouldn't hurt to get some briefing for an hour on Monday if we think we can deal with the drafting instructions in an hour. Maybe I'm being wildly optimistic about that, Chair. You'd know better than me. But I think if there's some room for flexibility, we can do what's on this subcommittee agenda, plus have, I would say, at least 3 meetings, and they don't have to be all in a row on the topic presented in the motion. I think it's a very valid for us to do what we can to draw attention to this, to see whether someone has any way forward, but certainly to ensure that the public is well aware of the threat that's imposed.
Hey, Damien. You're on mute, Damien.
My apologies. Thank you, Chair. An observation is I think everybody that I've heard speak actually agrees with the intent of the motion. Just the issue here is timing. Certainly in terms of the subject and reading the NSECOP report and hearing the testimony and from personal experience seeing both because I'm now an elected official, but also speaking with some academics and others that I know in that are researching these sorts of things. It's absolutely astounding the proliferation of hate-based extremism and its impacts in society, and certainly there's a whole range of subjects that will be studied on top of that. That won't be subject of parliamentary review, I'm sure. But so my comments are simply this: I agree with the motion, but I do believe that to suggest that it should preempt or be prioritized over all of the other work. I'd be happy if it could be slotted into free meetings, or if there's a change in schedule between now and whenever the next opportunity arises. It's very, very important. But so are some of the other things we're doing. So I would support the amendment for the timing, but I also plan to support the general motion, and I so far have not heard any opposition to it. So really, we're just debating the timing here. We're not debating the substance of the motion.
Pam?
Thanks, Chair. And thanks for everybody recognizing how important this is. I would actually argue, though, that you are, this will essentially kill the motion. It took us from February until last week to do this systemic racism report and get it back to the analyst. The analyst we haven't even seen the Levesque study yet. So I would suggest that we could do 1 hour on Monday, May the 10th, after we've done drafting instructions to the committee, and then take May 31st and June the 2nd as 2 dates that we can do on this study and then go back to the work plan. And we can save that fourth meeting until maybe the following Monday or the Monday after. And I would not support the amendment that's been put forward because it essentially kills this motion. We will not get time to do it unless members are prepared to sit through the summer. But it will essentially kill it. So I will absolutely not support the amendment. I think we could do 1 hour on the 10th, 2 meetings the week of the 31st and the 2nd, and then go back to the committee business. So I think that would be a compromise that we could make.
I think Christina was next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to correct what Mrs. Lambropoulos said. The amendment doesn't mean that we're not in favor of the study. I think we all said that it was an important study, but that's why we need to prioritize our studies. All the studies that we carry out are important. I think that we have to finish what we started, and as Jack said, we shouldn't stop everything we've already started just to do this study. If I've understood, we go until May 31st for the study on correctional services. And then after that, there's 7 meetings, which gives us a bit of time. I don't think that it kills the motion. And to have an hour on the 10th and then the rest in June, I don't see what that brings us. I think that maybe we should finish what we've already started and then dive into this study. To me, that would be the reasonable way of going about it. Let's finish what we've already started, and then we'll go ahead with this new study on violent extremism.
Next.
Never give up my turn to speak, Chair, but I think Jack was ahead of me, and then I. I'll defer to my elders.
So we want to hear from the left before we go right?
Yes.
Okay. Fine.
I just wanted to add that I think I'm prepared to be flexible here, and I don't know if we have to have a showdown on this. The idea of half an hour on May the 10th is appealing because that could get the start to the idea and working it in. I'm not sure, but Christina can say whether it's crucial that item number 7 be dealt with before the 31st. We're not going to write a report on that. It might be something that could be dealt with on early in June. But I think, if we have the right spirit here, I think we can accomplish this. I mean, to say that this motion is intended to shut down the study, the amendment rather, I think is wrong, and I think it's counterproductive to suggest that. I think there seems to be a willingness by the committee to accommodate this study, to fit it in, but I don't think people are prepared to give up what has already been proposed and agreed, but just the question of finding a way to do it. I'm prepared to suggest that we only look at 3 meetings for the corrections study. We have 3 topics. They're all important. The same goes with the idea of following up on Christina's motion. We need to do that, but that's not time sensitive in the sense it has to be done tomorrow or next week. So we can be flexible. We can do all these things with the right will. Maybe the amendment is a bit too specific instead of by saying it after we do all of this. I'm not going to propose an amendment to an amendment to an amendment because the chair would rule that out of order rightly. But I think I'm suggesting that we should try to find some consensus, if not today, then between now and Monday. But agree that maybe on Monday the 10th we can have a witness to give us an initial briefing for an hour.
That may be a bit of a challenge, but nevertheless, Glenn?
Well, I will agree with you, Chair, that it would be a challenge to get witnesses here on Monday, given we always usually try to give them time to prepare and send the invitation and whatever else. And not all of them will be in Ottawa, I'm sure. But, because they're remote, it would be good. I agree with Jack. This is an important study that needs to be done. It is as I said previously, no less important or more important than some of the other things that we already have on our schedule. And I would sooner I would sooner sit with this study for the 3 or 4 times that we are actually going to meet to do it, and get some meat around what it is that we're trying to uncover, as opposed to piecemeal it over time in between other things. And there are so significant issues that we have to deal with. We need to get the systemic racism reports finished. We need to get the Levesque report finished. There's Jack's motion that are actively impacting people's lives every day that we speak. What our non-work on these things will impact people's lives every single day. And it's happening in real time. So again, I agree, Jack. I'd like to be able to find a common ground that we can move forward on, but there has to be give on each side. And I think I would agree with your assessment that to try and paint the fact that we feel the studies that should be looked at ahead of this one means that we don't support the motion or we need to withdraw it is certainly erroneous. And we would not support that notion whatsoever. So I think let's rather than spinning our wheels, let's make a decision. Let's move on to try and find a decision on what is in the report that we can maybe give us a day so we can have something before the middle of June. Is there something that we need to look at that will make a difference there? I don't know the answer to that question. And I would just hope that we, is Bastrash one that we can just put off until we have a spare time? It's been sitting, it was written a long time ago. It was proposed and presented to us some time ago. We already have mention of it in the systemic racism report that's coming out. So can we give up a day there on it to then move up everything else on systemic racism, on Mr. Harris's motion, so that by the 1st of June or 2nd of June, we are already into 4 full meetings or whatever it takes, 3 full meetings of this report on extremism. And that would be reasonable and give on both sides.
Okay. I think it's Darren, and then I think it's either Pam or Damien.
No. Oh,
thank you, Mr. Chair. And I won't go on long, but and I want to congratulate folks for trying to be flexible here and come up with some alternatives and some opportunities to make sure we study this. But a 106.4, by its very nature, is an emergency motion. So it's one thing to say that we all agree that this is important and we should study it, but that we don't agree that it's an emergency. So we either agree that this is serious, and we listened to Mr. McGinty today and we read the report. This is either an emergency to all of us or it isn't, and we'll see that in the vote.
Point of order, Chair. This is not an emergency. It's an emergency motion. It's the motion that's urgent to get before the committee. The committee decides whether it's what level of emergency there is. I don't think that characterization is consistent with the rules.
I'm not sure where you are actually contradicting each other there. I'm going to go to
Thanks,
Pam.
Chair. I think people need to get their calendars out. On May 31st is when we start Jack's study. Then we have what's proposed with the border study, which is something that has already been looked at by the Auditor General. So I would hardly make that an emergency in my view, but I think you need to look at your calendars. So May 31st, we start Jack's study, then we've got the border, and then we've got the Levesque study to go through. So you can't possibly say that by delaying this, that this will not kill the report unless everyone on this committee is prepared to sit through the summer, because there is no way that we can do the work that's proposed before we get to this study. So either we feel that this is an important study that we need to do. And actually, the reason the Liberals sent in this letter is because we actually do feel that this is an emergency. We actually do feel that this is something that needs to take priority by this committee. And it's also something that has never been studied by this committee. This is an emerging issue, which I have heard about, but I was not aware of the severity of it until I read Mr. McGinty's report. And I think every single person on this committee should be seized with studying this right away. I mean, we can all say we want to work together, and I'm not trying to be confrontational here, but the fact is that we will never get to this study if we do it after we do all the other work that we have. So either we want to look at this pressing issue, which Mr. McGinty himself said that it was the most striking thing about the review. I mean, it's something, all you have to do is look online at all of the issues that are there to know. So I know we're only debating the amendment here, so I'm getting ahead of myself, except to say that if we remove the words starting immediately and starting on May 10th, we will, in fact, effectively kill this motion unless we decide right now that we're going to pick some other dates to do it at the end of May and the beginning of June. Otherwise, this will never happen. Thanks, Chair.
Damien.
So, thank you, Chair. With respect, I think that that is a false equivalency of epic proportions. This was submitted to Parliament and in this committee before the last subcommittee meeting. So to suggest somehow that we're not prioritizing this because we want to continue the good and important work, of which one of the items that we're finishing on this study was in fact an emergency motion brought forward, and I could get very political in terms of some of the delays. I won't, out of an effort to ensure that there's a degree of collaboration. But look, this is an important issue. I think everybody said that. Although I think that it's entirely reasonable for the discussion around timing. So if there's not a willingness to have that discussion, then I would question the intent. When and how this was brought up. As I've indicated, I plan to support the motion. I think that if there was a more collaborative attitude to ensure that we could find some ability to get this done. Personally, I have no problem sitting through the summer. I did it last summer. There's I think four meetings in June that are still available for opportunities if there was a level of flexibility, if witnesses canceled or there's evolving situations that exist. I think there's a tremendous amount that can be accomplished. It's just a matter of whether or not we can in fact agree that yes, it's important, and which I think we all do, and work together to try and find out a way that we can get it done. And quite frankly as well, this Parliament adjourns on June 23rd. There's options for the committee to sit throughout the summer. That's up to this committee to make that call. So to suggest that it kills the study is false. And then Parliament resumes sometimes in September. So let's. The false equivalencies of this is troubling to me for what is an important issue, and certainly I hope that we can be collaborative in a path forward. And I would note, Mr. Chair, we're far beyond the 15 minutes, so I'd simply call if there's a willingness to go to a vote.
I still see hands, but I just I've got a note from the clerk saying that we can go to 6:30. If we go beyond 6:30, we have to suspend in order for replacement of the support staff. So we seem to be down to a fairly narrow point, and that is some specificity on a date. It may or may not be useful for the committee to know that we have some challenges in getting Minister Blair and Commissioner Lucky on the 12th. We were just informed of that late today, which may possibly free up the 12th or for something else. Now, whether that is helpful to a deliberation or not, I can't say, but I just the clerk does yeoman work trying to fill our dates with meaningful work. But I just point out that the 12th may come available. That's all I can say is may come available. Glenn.
Thank you, Chair. I sense that. That's why I suggested that the Basrath report with Blair and Lucky, we can hold off, that we can move something else up that's on the report. I just want to clarify, this is an in-camera meeting.
No, it's not.
This is not an in-camera. Well, perfect. I want to then suggest that Mr. McGinty said clearly today, and the report clearly says, and because it's been mentioned erroneously today, that this domestic extremism, if you want to call it that, on Canadian soil is the top priority. Foreign, if you heard Mr. McGinty today, he did make it very, very clear that foreign threats is the top foreign threats are the top threats to this country and remains a top threat to this country. That does not diminish the importance of this study and the need for this study. I just want to put that in reference to it's important that we do. The timing of it is critical, and I think if we are willing to, we can get it done starting the beginning of June or thereabouts and be done before Parliament rises the 23rd of June easily, if we have a will to do so. And that's the key. We all have to have a will to do so. Okay.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I don't know. I mean, I'm not prepared to go very much longer, Chair. I mean, we've been extending, but there needs to be some kind of agreement on dates, not a general agreement. The motion that's before the committee doesn't leave that, the amendment that's before the committee doesn't leave that flexibility on an up and down vote. So I'm more inclined to let the meeting suspend and see if we can work something out on dates between now and Monday.
Pam?
Thanks, Chair. If we could agree to dates right now, so May 10th, 12th, May 31st, and June the 2nd, then that would be fine. Mr. McGinty did say that.
What does that do to Levesque?
We won't have it back yet. We won't have Levesque back yet.
Well, we'll have Levesque for drafting instructions on Monday the 10th, correct?
Right.
And then we won't have systemic racism back then yet.
No, we're doing that on May 26th, Glenn.
Right.
That's why I've skipped that one.
So is it possible that we can move some of Jack's information further forward, or his study, that consolidated study, to do some of that on the 10th and 12th, if we can't get the Blair here? I just
no, I don't. I'm not sure about that, Glenn, because we need some documents too for that. And those documents are not due till the 2nd of June, so there's some flexibility on that end for that study.
So I think it's my time right now.
Yes.
So people had indicated, would there be a willingness to compromise on this? So this is what I'm saying. We still think that this is something the committee should look at right away, but I would be willing to make some changes so that it was studied by that first week in June, because after that, then we get the Levesque study back, and the analyst was quite clear that it's going to take quite some time because of translation. So if we can't study it by that week of May 31st and June 2nd, I don't think we'll have an opportunity to do it. So if we could agree to dates right now, then I would be open to amending it like that, Chair.
Now, is it studied in full by that date or initiated by that date?
The 4 meetings by that date.
4 meetings by that date.
So
Chair, I'm withdrawing my unanimous consent to continue this meeting. We've gone beyond the 15 minutes that was agreed to. I don't think we can agree to this today. I think my suggestion of doing this between now and Monday is probably better, because I don't think this study can start on Monday because we've already decided it can't.
Well, In that circumstance, I believe I don't have any choice but to adjourn the meeting. That means the debate has not been resolved, and
Point of order, Chair. Do you not suspend the meeting though, and then we continue debate on Monday? Otherwise, my May 10th date. Otherwise, my May 10th date is out of date. If we suspend, the meeting continues as May the 5th. So I think we want to suspend debate.
I'll take guidance on from the clerk on whether I'm suspending or I'm adjourning. I thought I was suspending the debate and adjourning the meeting.
Mr. Chair, you could do either. Suspend until a future date or adjourn the meeting and resume debate on the motion at a future date.
Okay, well,
So, Chair, just point of order. We need to get this to, if we adjourn, someone's going to have to move this motion again. So I feel really strongly we need to suspend the debate, suspend the meeting, and we continue this meeting on Monday at 3:30.
No, but there's a distinction to be made here as to whether the meeting is to be adjourned, but the debate is suspended. And if the debate is suspended and we resume the meeting on Monday, there's nothing to stop you moving to continue the debate.
But I have to move it again, Chair.
I don't think you have to move it again. I think because all we're doing is suspending the debate as such.
But my motion has a date in it, which will be stale dated if we start the debate anew on Monday. So if we suspend debate, the date remains as May the 5th, and we can continue debate on the motion as it is.
Okay. Well, if there's some anxiety as to whether
point of order, Chair, I don't know how we can have a meeting on Monday and call it the 5th of May, and so that we can schedule something for the 10th of May on the 10th of May. It doesn't compute. I believe that the chair's ruling is correct, that if we suspend the debate and adjourn the meeting, then that's the debate that is still on deck on Monday. Am I wrong?
I don't think you're wrong, but because I can do it either way. But there's some anxiety that the motion will be lost if I just suspend this. If I don't suspend this meeting as well as suspending the debate. I thought I could adjourn the meeting and suspend the debate, and that would be by operation of the rules of procedure. But I'm perfectly happy to suspend the meeting and suspend the debate since we've run out of unanimous consent to keep this meeting going anyways. So given that there may be some anxiety as to whether that my initial thought is incorrect, I'm perfectly happy to suspend the meeting and suspend the debate.
Sorry, Chair, you're suspending the meeting, not the debate. So we'll suspend the meeting and then it will continue on Monday, right?
Well, but the debate is by definition suspended, and it will have to be. You'll still have to initiate the debate again. It will be the first item on the floor.
So we'll suspend the meeting. We'll suspend debate. Is that what you're saying? And then we've run out of time for the meeting. Because Jack's getting hangry.
I know.
That is the way I read the committee's chapter in the Green Book, Mr. Chair, that the meeting must be suspended rather than adjourned.
Okay, I'm perfectly happy to suspend. I'm not sure I agree, but as I initially interpreted it was to adjourn the meeting and suspend the debate. But if it's more comfortable to people to suspend the meeting, I'm perfectly happy to do so. And the meeting by definition, or the motion by definition, is suspended.
Chair, I just have a point of question.
Oh, well, good. I hope you get an answer.
Well, does that mean that, as someone has suggested, that the annoying Parview music will continue on for 3 days until we come back on Monday because the meeting's only suspended and not canceled or adjourned?
You're going to have to work out your own headphones on that, Glenn.
No. I'm talking about for the poor people who've been monitoring this on Parview, and that music will keep playing now for the next 3 days.
I see. Oh, those people. Yeah, I feel badly for them already.
Both of them.
Yeah. Okay. So in order to be able to make a comfort level for us all, the meeting is suspended.